And so these guys are throwing all this stuff together, led by Robin Carhart Harris and his team. And it's very fascinating. So they have these different lines of data that they start. I'm new to the Macintosh, so all the slides aren't so nice. But lines of data, psilocybin research. Okay, they're doing a lot of research with psilocybin from the mushrooms and seeing how those molecules affect people subjectively. What do they report subjectively through their experience? And simultaneously, what's going on in their brain through neural imaging, MRI and things like that, blood flow. What can they say? And then they're going, he's like, this guy's an old school. He's not a Jungian guy. He's like a Freudian guy. So he's into psychoanalysis and Freud, and he's trying to see how that fits into this model. And then he even goes as far as like thermodynamics, physics, so it gets a little intense. I don't understand all of it, but I'm going to try to translate what I understand. And then they review a lot of other things. And then I add some of my own ideas, which are mostly drawn from other people's ideas. So this is the spectrum that they propose, okay, that I'm going to try to walk us through, and then it'll just be a little theme. So they're saying that, okay, we have this in the bottom left, the modern human, normal waking consciousness. Like that's us, the modern human, maybe the modern American, human just in their normal waking consciousness. And they're saying kind of like along the lines of what people have brought up a little bit, they have this idea of like, then entropy, this thermodynamic concept of like that everything is like in nature and the universe is tending towards disorder and chaos. That's the natural flow of somehow. That direction is the way things flow according to physics, in our universe. And that can be very overwhelming to the human mind. Perhaps the plants and the animals are comfortable, in that kind of state and consciousness. That's what he's suggesting. And people have kind of gotten at that, that maybe in the natural state and flow, that kind of thing is tolerable, but for the modern civilized human, that's a little intense. It's a little too much for a lot of people. So they say that the mind, is actually kind of helping to bring us down and suppress that a little bit and get us into just kind of a functional, more sane kind of mental state. And that brings us, they're saying it brings us out of some of that entropy, suppresses some of the entropy. And part of what they're talking about is they're actually looking at the brain functioning and the firing of the brain and the networks of the brain and all these different things. And they're studying that, like when it's more entropic, when it seems more disordered and chaotic, as in it seems more like everything else, and when it's more shut down, less entropic. Like those are mathematically described ideas and topics based on their measurements. So they're saying, you see the modern human normal is kind of like it's suppressed entropy by the mind, and they're suggesting that's actually the mind and the ego that play that function to suppress things, to keep us kind of a little more grounded, a little more sane, or as they would say, like what are the positive, aspects of the ego? Some of them like keep things more coherent, more discerning. Sometimes if you're kind of out there, it's a little bit tough to tell what's coming from the inside and what's from the outside. What am I projecting here? Some reality testing. It's good for that. Kind of organizing things, hierarchical thinking, minimizing surprise and uncertainty. So you could imagine like in a heavily traumatized situation, your ego would react, you want to minimize surprise and uncertainty. So you have maybe ego structures that form to protect you in response to trauma. And so then, it's more settling. You come down, you get out of the entropy, you're more realistic, but also there's a tendency, subjectively, what you observe is maybe to be more narrow-minded. And so that can be a little bit of a pitfall. When we go the other direction, they're saying that they're noticing links between these different states, like the psychedelic experience. They're saying shares qualities with REM sleep, the dreams, rapid eye movement. Early psychosis, people in early psychosis, post-seizure dreamy states, these people with temporal lobe epilepsy, they get into these kind of very interesting altered states after their seizures, and maybe severe stress. But because those bottom four are a little tough to capture, the psychedelic state is a very interesting one to investigate, because you can give somebody a pill and see what happens, and ask them questions and then try to relate it to the other lines of data. So in the Freudian kind of thing, the self versus like maybe the higher self that Jung is talking about, that's how I would say the higher self. The self is the mind and the ego. And so they're saying that's really involved with metacognition, like being aware of your awareness, being able to think about your thoughts, self-reflective, your self-narrative, the story you tell yourself. That's what's going on. And so then when we strengthen that, we go down into this less entropy, into these things I just talked about, more coherent, more realistic, maybe a little more narrow-minded. But if we dissolve the ego, they're saying through psychedelics, this is what their research is showing, then we go into this state of primary consciousness. And they're relating this primary consciousness to like psychedelic state, dreams, early psychosis, blah, blah, blah. That this is kind of expanded consciousness in this spectrum, and that there's evidence that it's more entropic in the brain function. It's more chaotic, it's more disordered. And so you also see, there's more uncertainty when you enter those realms. There's puzzlement, it's confusion. It's more flexible. It can be more creative, but it can be a little ungrounded. And, it can be more open-minded, expanding consciousness. So they're putting out this spectrum that they're basing in what they're recording in the brain. So then I'm saying that this mind and ego, this situation, is shaped by our experiences, by our relationships, and by our culture. So if, for instance, your culture was driving you down in the entropic scale, making you more narrow-minded, it may result in a few health problems, perhaps. So if you have a culture that's ego-dominated, like perhaps our culture, the me culture, the ego-driven culture, what's in it for me culture, like a lot of traditional people say, and a lot of people have said tonight, such a way of thinking, such a mindset, such a culture can cut you off from your feeling, and this feeling is kind of the gateway to our heart and soul from a traditional perspective, and you might end up trapped in your mind. You might just be trapped in your mind. So the thing is, the problem with that, the reality, for the people that have had the experience, your heart and your feeling and your senses are what connect you to the world, and to the universe, in fact. And if you get disconnected from that, you feel very disconnected. You don't have a place. You have this existential crisis. Why was I born? What am I doing here? The people in the village, they know where their food's coming from. They know where the wood came from to build their table. They know everything about their life and their ecosystem. They don't have that crisis. They're not disconnected. They don't sit there like, oh, why was I born? You don't see that in the natural human being. It's a consequence of some cultural intervention. But, sometimes, this heart, this feeling, all this stuff can be so overwhelming to your mind, that it becomes ineffable, like as people have described. How could I put it into words? How could I describe it? It was an experience, the direct experience. Is the only way to really share about what it's like. So now we have to get into the risks. So why about expanding consciousness and settling down consciousness or constraining consciousness? What are the risks? So yeah, it's we see it all the time at the Ayahuasca Center. Definitely. You do have the risk of, the uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. That has a certain amount of risk. Magical thinking. Some people get a little carried away. There is faith and belief and love and spirituality, but there is also, paranoid delusions and delusions of grandeur and psychosis. That is just not really fitting into any kind of healthy outcome. And there's maybe even optimism that's ungrounded. Just gets carried away. Yeah. We're getting to that. This guy, I owe you $5. So that's that. But then, if the ego is too strengthened, if this ego is too strengthened, then we get into this narrow-mindedness. Just like in the paper, they say, as open-mindedness is to optimism, narrow-mindedness is to pessimism. So repetitive thinking and behaviors, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, addiction are all examples of like a mind trapped in a repetitive circuit. So, eventually at its end all places, if you get to a place where everything sucks, when the mind is completely convinced of that, perpetual negativity, and you're also convinced that there's no way out. That's the classic hell of depression and all these kind of feelings, which is in fact a lie of the mind that we get trapped in. That's not true. But when you're in it, you believe it because that's your experience. And you're cut off from feeling anything else that might illuminate you in some other direction. So interface between mind and feeling. So how you relate to your feeling is derived from what you learn from your relationships, as I said, and your culture. if your culture encourages you to ignore your feelings, get back to work in your cubicle, go back to the battlefield, etc., and the world outside of you, your community, your relationships, your ecosystem, then you will lose connection with your senses and your feeling, and you may feel lost in your mind. So my brother used to work for human rights. I don't know what time it is. Okay, we're okay. My brother used to work for Amnesty International, and we had these bushmen from the Kalahari, the San people of the Kalahari. These guys are living in the bush. They grew up that way, at least hunting and gathering, with lions and all the rest of it. So we were on the fire at night, and the guys were telling stories. And they said, why do people get nightmares? The guy's like, what, do you guys remember? Does anybody know why people get nightmares? And everyone was like, throwing their hands. No. He's shutting everybody down. You guys have forgotten everything. You've forgotten everything. He says, forget that whole topic, that line of questions. He says, why, let me ask you this. He's like, why does the bushman, when he sleeps, he always sleeps like this with his ear cupped to the ground on his side? He's like, you see the bushman, he always sleeps like that. That's how the bushman sleeps. Why does the bushman sleep like that? So he says, for the bugs, for this, for that, for this, for that. He says, no. He says, you sleep like that because when you cup your ear on the ground, you can sense like a good, 10 feet, 10 yards, I don't know, around you. You can hear the grass move. You feel it more when you do that. And when you connect to your setting, to where you are, through your senses, through your body, then you can rest easy because you know what's coming. So instead of using your mind, he says, what happens to you when you get nightmares is your mind travels and takes you away to a world of pure fear that's totally disconnected, So it's like you have to come back into your senses to come out of that. And that's in the Icaros, the songs that we sing to people, like in the tradition that I learn in, the Icaros, when someone is afraid, you sing to them to center their mind, to center their senses, to get their senses connected, to center their mind. And that centering in the tradition is to center it back into the channel through their heart. And eventually all the chakras. But the idea is they need to come back into not just their mind, their thinking mind, but their senses and the way that connects to their heart. And that's what helps people come out of their fear. That's what those songs are about. So our culture is cut off from our feeling and is afraid to lose control. There's a whole book about this called Ascent of Humanity by Eisenstein, and he has his solutions that he proposes. He says, over-focus on mind, ego-driven culture leaves us at increased risk of developing depression, anxiety, and mentally driven disorders. Complex mental solutions, reductionist thinking, are often inadequate healthcare solutions, like we talked about. For example, this was from, I don't know if you guys seen Neurons to Nirvana. That's a great movie. Neurons to Nirvana, and Groff in that movie, he says, the idea of a single molecule like Prozac solving depression. He's like, come on, that's inadequate. Is it okay to say that? That it's like the problem is obviously more complex than that? So that's the issue. If you have an ego-driven problem and then you try to solve it with an ego-driven solution, ego plus ego, you get more ego. You don't always find your way out. So we need to put the feeling back into healing. As Jeremy Narby said at the LSD symposium, science can't dance, And so when you need a natural and simple solution to a problem and all you're doing is throwing complex, reductionist thinking at it, sometimes you don't get to the heart of the matter, and in fact, there is a heart of the matter. So back to the default mode network. Dun, 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 dun. So the default mode network, so then these guys are saying, okay, this is just talk, Freudian theory, the ego, blah, blah, blah. Who cares? The doctors don't care. The scientists don't care. It's like, no, they've identified this network of centers in your brain that are functioning that are called default mode network. And they're saying we have evidence to show that it looks like this default mode network is a neural correlate of the ego. That you can show that, like, when it's very active, people have kind of like more ego-minded consciousness, and when it's less active, some of them, like, for example, if you turn it off with psychedelics, they say, oh my God, my ego dissolved. And then they're saying if you have a long-term meditator, their default mode network is less active. So this idea, and that like big functions of the default mode network are this self-reflection, this self-narrative, this metacognition. That's what's going on when it's very active. So then when the default mode network is less active and you decrease the activity and you also decouple it from the limbic system, okay, this emotional processing through the medial temporal lobe, these things I mentioned earlier as one example. I'm not saying it's the whole answer, but it's something that then the limbic system, their activity starts getting more disorganized, more chaotic, more free-flowing, anarchic, as they would say, more entropic. It's unchained, So what happens to people when you do that? Well, then they have these emotional experiences. They relive old traumas. They go through all these things. They have spontaneous insights. Sometimes they feel like all this creativity, all these different things happen and flow. Also, the risks, also come on. The delusions and the magical thinking, the paranoia, that's also in there. When it's more active, when maybe it's hyperactive or parts of it are hyperactive, you see that in depression in some of these states. So now it's like back to this thing again, like, okay, there is a physical basis for some of these thoughts. So it's okay for us to talk about, science of the soul to a degree. So the default mode network in neurosciences is according to Wikipedia. The default mode network is a network of brain regions that are active when the individual is not focused on the outside world and the brain is at wakeful rest. The paper, okay, just to, without getting crazy, but this is the way they talk. Specifically, we propose that within default mode network, resting state functional connectivity, that's to say like it's at its resting state, and spontaneous synchronous oscillatory activity in the posterior cingulate cortex, which is a part of the default mode network when it's in a certain rhythm, particularly in the alpha frequency, certain alpha frequency, that can be treated as neural correlates of ego integrity. The reason they say that is because when they shut down, through psychedelics, for example, these aspects of what's seen in the imaging, people have ego dissolution experiences. So I'm saying decrease in the above, as with psychedelics and meditation, are associated with the subjective experience of ego dissolution. So other little quotes I'm throwing out there just to get it in there. Importantly, the functional centrality of the default mode network is not shared by other brain networks, implying that as the highest level of functional hierarchy, it serves as a central orchestrator or conductor of global brain function, that it's like this central organizer. Functionally, the default mode network is relatively removed from sensory processing, what we've been talking about, and is instead engaged during high-level metacognitive operations such as self-reflection, theory of mind, mental time travel, functions which may be exclusive to humans. Default mode network connectivity increases through development from birth to adulthood. We see this kind of pile up, the ego. And default mode network regions have undergone significant evolutionary expansion, through the animals to the human. Despite our knowledge of these things, however, it is poorly understood why the default mode network consumes so much of the body's energy. So it seems like there's a lot of energy that's poured into this. The brain's already taking a lot of energy, and a huge portion is going to the default mode network. So that's becoming a big interest area in neuroscience. Whoa, what's going on? And these guys are saying, we think it's the ego. So moving on, so this is the thing again, the default mode network. So when we shut it down a little bit, when we decouple it from the limbic system, from the emotional system, we see people come into primary consciousness more, okay? Whether it's probably in psychedelic states, you see it in dream states, in psychosis, et cetera, et cetera. And when it's more restrained, sometimes we see people more in what we call normal waking consciousness. So back to this, if we dissolve ego, we decrease activity, we decouple, we see more uncertainty, more puzzlement, more flexibility, more creativity, and sometimes more open-mindedness. If we strengthen it, the activity, we see, all this other stuff, uncertainty and surprise decreased, but we become a little closed-minded, disconnected from our senses, overly active, narrow-minded thinking. So this is just some of their data as an example. They're showing, here's them on psilocybin, and my thoughts wander freely, and then they're showing it relating to all these areas of blood flow and imaging in the brain of these centers related to the default mode network. So again, the risks, there they are, yes, okay, if we're pushing people into primary consciousness, we need to be very careful. If they're getting there on their own or otherwise, still people need guidance and they need to learn about this, to make the most of such a thing, because there are unstable states in the chaos. It's a reality. Just like the other side might be overly stable, there is the possibility of instability. So how do you, but still, this therapeutic potential of increased entropy does exist. So beyond, it's not just scattered psychotic experiences. It's not just a horror show in the ayahuasca ceremony. A lot of people are having highly prized spiritual experiences. So just a couple, they just have a couple studies they sent, the LSD for alcoholism, they're showing some good research. They're showing the psilocybin study they did with Griffiths produced profound existential experiences in healthy volunteers that led to lasting beneficial impact. Then also for the advanced stage cancer, significantly reduced anxiety and depression scores. In another study, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, was significantly reduced with psilocybin. So just to finish up, it's this idea of, this is a whole other book, this guy Modell talks about imagination and the meaningful brain. So it's a kind of an intense book, but I thought it was very interesting. And he's talking about this limbic system and what happens to us in our minds. And he's, what I relate to what he said to what they're talking about ego dominance and things like that, is you freeze your metaphors. You freeze your art, your creativity, because that's where the reimagination, that's the recontextualization, that's where the new possibilities come from. And if that system is stuck, there's wrenches in the gears, then you're unable to do that. So he talks about metaphors as just being like, it's one of the main functions of our brain is to relate different domains. He calls that a metaphor. So relating the domain of my thoughts to my feelings, for example, that's one of the functions of the brain. And he says that's a metaphor. And if that's broken, if that's not working right, there's other metaphors of like relating the smell to this thought. All these ideas, you can imagine that's what our brain's doing, is connecting different domains. And if that's broken down, and it's that metaphorical system that creates, just like art, just like this poetry and things like that, this new story, this new understanding. And so he says that, this metaphorical system mostly operates subconsciously. And he uses these examples in his book of all these famous mathematicians and physicists that, like, when they wanted to solve some problem, the key is they think about, okay, I'm going to solve that problem. And then next step, stop thinking about it and let it percolate. Get the mind out of the way, let the subconscious, metaphorical, perhaps it's limbic, let that system work on it, and then spontaneously it will start, and that's what they talk about with this entropic brain function. You get into these other stages of possibilities where like avalanches of networks start happening. Things start coming together in ways that your mind can't keep up with, but that we're actually designed to do those things. So, like I said, trauma ego, that's what we call it down at the center sometimes. This idea that you'd have ego in response to trauma, trying to protect you, trying to reduce uncertainty, reduce surprise. So you freeze up, your metaphorical system. And then one area that he talks about how the metaphors get frozen is like now the past relating to the present, that metaphor frozen. So now when you experience the past, this guy walks up to the airport, and he's talking to the guy, and he's in a uniform, and he's at the counter, and he's telling him this strong thing. All of a sudden, he's back in the concentration camp, because he's triggered, and he can't differentiate. He's locked, it's frozen, it's stuck, and so his metaphor system is broken. So ego dissolution, allows for these things to just flow freely again, without your prediction, without your anticipation. Sometimes it's very difficult. And that's one other aspect, So I'm saying this has to be guided, ideally integrated. And then I was just in a sweat lodge. I got invited to sweat lodge the other day, and they were talking about, the tradition. How do you go to this heart space? How do you come into a heart space and let yourself be guided by a heart space where this stuff can happen freely and you can let your mind go? Which is really like, that's what the Ikaro is. When you just drink a lot of ayahuasca and you're singing to somebody, and then all of a sudden, boom, your mind is gone. But I'm still singing to them, we call, people call it channeling, plant spirits, whatever you want to call it. It's just your heart opening and flowing, and you don't need your mind to do things like that, and everybody has been there. And in sports, they say, oh, well, he was unconscious. Look what he did, this magical thing that he did. So it's part of our everyday life, actually, this kind of thing. So guided and integrated, and then the other part that the leader of the sweat lodge wanted to make very clear to people, and this is part of why people don't want to get out of their egos and why they're so comfortable, and we've been creating a more and more comfortable ego structure in our culture, in our society, is that number one, it's hard work. It's very, very hard work. And number two, that involves a lot of sacrifice. So those are two of the main reasons I would say this is not for you, is if you don't want to do that. The people that come to our center, it's like, guess what? Yeah, it's hard work and it involves a lot of sacrifice, but that's maybe what you need to get through. And in fact, he would say there's no other way. It doesn't have to be ayahuasca. Do it any other way. But the reality is you have to put in the hard work and you have to sacrifice to overcome those things. And if you're going to go into some primary conscious state, through psychedelics, something, have it be guided, unless you're a master, which I don't think you are, unless you've gone through some official training and, had the experience. But there is experience out there to draw from, or maybe you are. And then also the integration of those experiences, like people have been talking about, is so crucial. So last couple things. Healing through ego dissolution, decreased default mode network activity and coupling. So this is what they say. This is the end of their paper. Thus, in summary, it is hypothesized that there is a basic mechanism by which psychedelics can be helpful in psychiatry, whether they be used to treat depression, OCD, or addiction. Specifically, it proposes that psychedelics work by dismantling reinforced patterns of negative thought and behavior, by breaking down the stable, spatial, temporal patterns of brain activity upon which they rest. An important caveat, however, is that in order for this process to be beneficial, the drug-induced transitions to and the return from primary consciousness must be mediated by appropriate therapeutic care, and moving the brain out of subcritical modes and into unfamiliar terrain may present some risks, loss of contact with reality, persistent magical delusional thinking, if not properly managed. So last thing, I have 2 slides. Spiritual practice and psychedelics can provide the opportunity to see beyond our mind. So I'm saying, psychedelics, we're talking about psychedelics, spiritual practice, because that's what ayahuasca shamanism is, and at least in my tradition, what I'm educated in, it's a spiritual practice. It's a form of spiritual practice. So a huge part, just like you heard from her treatment did not involve ayahuasca, guided by a person who is traditionally known as an ayahuasquero. The idea is the diet, all these other things, meditating. These guys that train at our center for 1 year, they drink ayahuasca sometimes more often if they're wild, but they're supposed to drink twice a month to learn to become an ayahuasquero. In other words, when they're done, they're going to drink every ceremony, 4 nights a week, boom, 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 boom. But on the way there, 2 times a month, because it's way more about your internal process and preparing and meditating and all this stuff. Just like you said, you can go into these altered states and have this big experience, but how are you going to bring it home? And how are you going to live that? How is that going to change your day-to-day life? And, basically spiritual practice of some form or another is going to be what helps you lock that in. So I'm saying spiritual practice and psychedelics potentially can provide the opportunity to see beyond our mind, our ego, and our culture, which is a lot of times what we need, and thus gives us an opportunity to reconcile our lives from a broader perspective. This can be highly beneficial in addressing maladaptive ego structures rooted in trauma, disconnecting us from the present, leaving us locked in the past. Guidance and integration are crucial in exploring primary consciousness, hyperdimensional navigation. I'm throwing it back out there. Perhaps healthy exploration of primary consciousness might be akin to development of a healthy relationship with our higher self. So this is this higher culture. So the question is, when I'm out there in the primary, thing, in the primary consciousness, and it's all, I could be deluded and I can be paranoid and I can be confused, what do I use to guide myself there? It's like, well, there's a higher self, for you to get to know and explore and, see the world from that. So then I'm saying, in this higher state, when your default mode network gets shut down, you can be guided by your higher self, And like the Sweat Lodge leader, he says, it's not about complexity anymore. Now it's very simple. Now we go to very simple, very natural. So I'm saying hyperdimensional navigation, which we would like at our center, la dieta, like you're on the diet. It's like, okay, you have your ceremony. People talk, well, I said in the ceremony. It's like, well, that's not what we do. We do sit in the ceremony like at night, but the rest of the time, all day, all night, what are you doing? You're in an experience. You're in an attempt to heal yourself. So during that time, which I would also include in the hyperdimensional navigation session, you're trying to overcome narrow-mindedness. How do you do that? You explore primary consciousness utilizing your heart sense. You check in with your soul and your spirit. You prepare to transcend the mind through spiritual practice. So you prepare through spiritual practice. Now when you do transcend the mind, you're ready. You're more ready. We hear that all the time from people who have experienced meditation and things like that. Keep it simple. Focus on love, forgiveness, compassion, gratitude, faculties of the spirit, faculties of the heart. That's what's going to get you through, what might be a nightmare. Open your mind. If your mind starts closing in and telling you there's no way out, you're screwed, this is the bad trip, you're never going to get out of here, open your mind. The curiosity, that's what the shamans teach. Be curious. Look, there's one little piece of you, one thread that can still see something. Look for something. There might be, there's a little something there. Go with that. Creativity, imagine something. Be creative. Okay, there's nothing here. What am I going to do? I got to come up with something. I'm not just going to be stuck in this trap. seek the guidance of experienced masters, reach for spiritual guidance, through faith. So that's another opportunity for those people who want to go that far with it. When you're out there, talk to the spirits, find the good spirit to guide you, pray to God if that's what you believe. Beware of the risks and prepare appropriately. Recognize the crucial importance of integration to secondary consciousness and the ego-driven culture. You go down to Peru, you're in the whole thing, it's great. You come back and it's a real big shift. All right, thank you. That's the talk. Thank you.